Here's a professionally rewritten version with smoother narration, richer atmosphere, and a more cinematic historical romance style while preserving the original story. It is a tragedy. We are forced to drag her everywhere we go. The older woman's voice cut through the swelling orchestra like the edge of a sharpened blade. Look at her hiding against the wall like a frightened little mouse. Plain, penniless, and utterly forgettable. Mark my words, Cecily, no gentleman will ever want her. We shall be burdened with the girl for the rest of our lives. The shadows behind the velvet curtain stirred. A tall man stepped from the darkness into the warm glow of the candlelight. The flickering flames revealed the hard, uncompromising lines of his face and the quiet authority in his posture. He never glanced at the cruel stepmother. Instead, he walked directly toward the forgotten girl, standing alone by the wall. The London season smelled of desperate ambition, expensive perfume, and fatting rosewater. Lydia Harrington stood at the very edge of Lord Danbury's magnificent ballroom, pressing her back against the cool plaster wall as though she could disappear into it. She wished she could. The grand hall overflowed with London's highest society. Hundreds of elegantly dressed ladies and gentlemen crowded beneath glittering crystal chandeliers, their laughter blending with the music of the orchestra. Heavy silk gowns brushed across polished marble floors while powdered wigs, sparkling jewels, and whispered gossip filled every corner of the room. The air was almost unbearable. Heat from hundreds of wax candles mingled with perfume, until every breath felt heavy. Lydia quietly tugged at the sleeves of her gown. It was an unfortunate shade of muddy brown. Her stepmother had insisted the color suited her complexion. Lydia knew better. The dress had been cut from old fabric discarded 4 seasons ago and altered just enough to conceal her figure instead of flattering it. Every stitch reminded her exactly where she stood within the Harrington household. "Stand up straight, Lydia." The sharp whisper landed like a slap. Lydia immediately straightened. Lady Harrington appeared from the crowd, her elegant smile never reaching her eyes. Behind her floated Cecily, Lydia's beautiful stepsister, glowing beneath layers of pale pink silk that shimmered beneath the candlelight. "You were slouching," Lady Harrington said coldly, making no effort to lower her voice. Her gaze traveled over Lydia with the detached irritation one might reserve for an unwanted stain. "If you insist on accompanying us, the least you can do is appear grateful, though heaven knows why I continue wasting carriage space on you." "I am grateful, stepmother." The words tasted like ashes. "See that you remain so." Lady Harrington gently adjusted the diamond brooch pinned to Cecily's bodice before continuing. "Tonight is important. The Duke of Kinsley has returned to London." Her eyes gleamed with naked ambition. "They say he intends to choose a wife before the season ends, and Cecily is precisely the sort of fresh, flawless beauty that captures a man's attention." Her gaze shifted back toward Lydia. "You, on the other hand, will remain exactly where you belong, out of the way. Do not speak unless spoken to, and for heaven's sake, try not to look quite so painfully pathetic." With that, Lady Harrington swept gracefully back into the ballroom, guiding the smiling Cecily toward a gathering of titled gentlemen. Lydia released a slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears accomplished nothing. When her father died 3 years earlier, leaving every penny of his estate under his widow's control, Lydia had discovered the true price of grief. Crying did not fill an empty stomach. It did not buy new gowns. It certainly did not transform an unwanted stepdaughter into someone worthy of affection. It simply changed nothing. She watched the dancers with quiet detachment. The London marriage market was little more than a cattle auction wrapped in velvet and music. Young ladies were polished until they sparkled, then displayed before wealthy titled gentlemen who judged them by beauty, fortune, and family connections. Romance existed only in cheap novels sold to impressionable girls. Reality was a negotiation. Nothing more. A passing footman offered a silver tray of lemonade. Lydia accepted a glass, not because she was thirsty, but because it gave her trembling hand something to hold. The slight shaking came mostly from hunger. Lady Harrington had ordered an embarrassingly small dinner, claiming heavy meals ruined a lady's figure before a ball. Lydia knew the truth. Every spare coin had gone toward Cecily's gowns, jewelry, and dancing lessons, leaving little for the household pantry. Across the ballroom, Cecily laughed brightly at something a red-faced viscount had said. Lydia watched without resentment. Cecily was not truly cruel, only careless. She had been raised believing the world existed for her happiness, while Lydia had quietly become part of the furniture. The orchestra began another graceful waltz. The center of the ballroom cleared as important couples stepped forward. Lydia retreated even farther toward the open French doors, leading onto the moonlit terrace. The cool night air touched her face. She welcomed it. Unlike people, the cold never pretended to be kind. Dark and brooding but richer than the king, he is exactly the sort to want a cheerful, compliant wife. Dominic blew a stream of smoke into the night air, highly amused. Terrifying, brooding, and looking for compliant, he filed the description away. Then why did we bring Lydia? Cecily complained, adjusting her bodice. She stood by the door, looking like a grim specter. It's embarrassing, Mama. She makes us look like we run a charity ward. Dominic paused his cigar halfway to his mouth. He peered through the gloom. Through the crack in the curtains, he could just make out a figure standing in the ballroom pressed against the far wall, a girl in a horrendous brown dress. Her face was pale, devoid of makeup. Her dark hair pulled back severely. She was holding a glass of lemonade as if it were a shield. We brought her because if I leave her at home, the servants talk. Lady Harrington sneered. Her tone was venomous, the kind of casual cruelty that only breeds in domestic captivity. People wonder why the poor orphan stepdaughter is locked away. It is all optic, Cecily. But she's so dreary, Cecily sighed. She is a necessary burden. Lady Harrington's voice grew harder, cutting through the cold night air. But do not worry about her competing with you. Just look at her. A drab, penniless little mouse in a ruined gown. Dominic felt his jaw clench. He had seen brutality in the slums, violence in the boxing rings, but there was a specific bloodless savagery to the aristocracy that disgusted him more than anything else. It is a tragedy. We must drag her along. Lady Harrington continued her contempt absolute. Make no mistake, Cecily, nobody will want her. We shall be saddled with the girl until we die. No man of worth would look twice at such a miserable creature. The words hung in the air, heavy and ugly. Dominic looked back at the girl in the brown dress. She wasn't looking at the dancers. She was looking at her shoes. Her shoulders were rigid, braced against an invisible weight. She was completely alone in a room full of hundreds of people. He looked at the cigar in his hand. He dropped it onto the flagstones and crushed it slowly beneath the heel of his boot. Nobody will want her. Dominic adjusted the cuffs of his tailored black evening coat. He stepped out of the shadows. Sound of Dominic's boots on the stone terrace was heavy and deliberate. Lady Harrington spun around, a gasp escaping her lips. When she registered the tall, imposing figure emerging from the dark, the blood drained from her face. She recognized him instantly. The harsh features, the dark, unyielding stare. "The Duke of Kinsley, Your Grace," she stammered instantly, plastering on an erring smile that looked grotesque under the circumstances. We did not realize anyone was out here. The air is so bracing." She shoved Cecily forward slightly. "May I present my daughter, Cecily? She was just remarking on how much she enjoys a cool evening." Dominic didn't look at Cecily. He didn't even acknowledge her existence. He kept his pale gray eyes fixed dead on Lady Harrington, the silence stretched tight as a drawn boring. "Lady Harrington," Dominic said. His voice was a low, rough baritone that carried no warmth whatsoever. "You are standing in my way." Lady Harrington blinked, confused. "Your Grace, move." It wasn't a request. It was a command issued by a man who was used to absolute obedience, flustered and red-faced. Lady Harrington stumbled backward, dragging Cecily with her, clearing the path to the French doors. Dominic walked past them without a backward glance. He stepped through the threshold, sweeping the velvet curtains aside, and entered the glaring light of the ballroom. The effect was immediate. The chatter nearest the doors died down, heads turned, whispers rippled outward like a stone dropped in a pond. "Kinsley, the Duke is here." Dominic ignored the gaping ton. He walked with a slight rolling limp, but his stride ate up the distance across the polished floor. He bypassed 3 earls, ignored the frantic waving of a dowager duchess, and walked directly toward the far wall. Lydia saw him coming. Her first thought was that he looked incredibly angry. His brow was furrowed, his jaw set like granite. Her second thought was to move out of his path. She pressed herself harder against the wall, assuming he was headed for the refreshment table behind her. He didn't walk past her. He stopped dead in front of her. Up close, he was intimidating. He loomed over her, a solid wall of black wool and crisp white linen. He smelled of cold night air, tobacco, and expensive soap. Lydia stared at his cravat, her heart hammering suddenly in her chest. She didn't dare look up. She had been instructed to be invisible, and this man was drawing the eyes of the entire room. "Put the glass down," he said. Lydia jumped slightly. She looked up finally, meeting his gaze. His eyes were startlingly light against the dark tan of his skin. There was no pity in them. Good, she hated pity. "I beg your pardon," she whispered. "The lemonade," Dominic said, nodding toward her hand. "It's warm, it tastes like chalk, and you are gripping it so tightly the glass is going to shatter. Put it down." Without thinking, Lydia turned and placed the glass on a passing footman's tray. When she turned back, the Duke had extended his hand, palm up, toward her. "Dance with me." Lydia froze. The silence in their immediate vicinity was absolute. She could feel the collective stare of the ballroom burning into her skin. From the corner of her eye, she saw Lady Harrington and Cecily standing near the French doors, their mouths hanging open in identical expressions of shock. "You are mistaken," Seldia said, finding her voice. It was raspy from disuse, but steady. "You must have me confused with someone else. I do not dance. I'm not confused, and I do not make mistakes," Dominic replied, his voice carrying clearly over the hushed crowd. "You are Miss Lydia, and you are going to dance with me unless you genuinely prefer the company of that plaster wall." Lydia looked at his hand. Clear as throat, it was a large, calloused hand, not the soft, manicured hand of a dandy. It was the hand of a man who worked. "I'm not dressed for the floor," she pointed out brutally, refusing to play the coy maiden. "My dress is old. I am wearing scuffed boots. If you are trying to make some sort of mockery of me for a wager, I ask you to leave me be. I have had quite enough humiliation for one evening." Dominic's expression softened just a fraction. The anger in his eyes receded, replaced by a sharp, assessing respect. "No wages," he said quietly so only she could hear. "No mockery, only a dance. Take my hand, Lydia. Let them choke on it." Something in his tone, the cynical dark edge of it, resonated deep within her. It was the voice of someone who hated this room just as much as she did. Slowly, her hand trembling just a bit, Lydia placed her fingers in his palm. His grip was warm and firm. He didn't lead her delicately. He pulled her decisively into the center of the floor just as the orchestra, recovering from their shock, struck up a slow waltz. Dominic placed his hand on her waist. He didn't hover his fingers respectfully above the fabric. He settled his hand firmly against her back, pulling her close. The heat radiating from him was a shock to her cold system. "Look at me," he commanded softly as they began to turn. Lydia raised her chin. "I am looking. Don't look at them. They don't matter," Dominic said, guiding her smoothly around a stumbling Viscount. "They are vultures in silk." "Tell me, do you always let that woman speak of you that way?" Lydia's breath hitched, he heard. Lydia said, her defenses instantly slamming into place. "A rescue? How terribly gallant. I suppose you expect me to swoon in gratitude." Dominic let out a short, rough bark of laughter. It was a startling sound, genuine and loud. Several matrons nearby gasped. "I expect you to keep your feet moving so I don't step on your scuffed boots," he retorted. "And no, I am not gallant. I am annoyed. There is a difference. I was trying to enjoy a quiet cigar on the terrace, and your stepmother's shrieking ruined the peace. So you asked me to dance to spite her partially. That is incredibly petty, Your Grace. I'm a petty man, Miss Lydia. Ask anyone. Dominic looked down at her. The hostility in her eyes was magnificently sharp. She wasn't shrinking anymore. She was furious. He liked it. But I also asked you to dance because you were the only person in this room who looked as miserable as I felt. I thought we might suffer together. Lydia stared at him. He wasn't feeding her compliments. He wasn't pretending her dress was beautiful or her situation was tragic. He was simply acknowledging reality. It is a very ugly dress, Lydia said, a defensive reflex. It is a catastrophic dress, Dominic agreed instantly. Looks like wet dirt, but the woman wearing it has a spine of steel, and that is a rare commodity in London. Lydia felt a strange, terrifying flutter in her chest. She clamped down on it immediately. Hope was dangerous. It made you soft. You will ruin her night, Lydia murmured, glancing over Dominic's shoulder. Lady Harrington was standing by the punch bowl looking as though she were about to suffer an apoplexy. She spent the entire household budget outfitting my sister to catch your eye. Then she is a terrible investor, Dominic said dryly. He pulled Lydia a fraction closer, steering her through a tight turn, because my eye is entirely occupied. Tell me, Lydia, do you ride? I haven't ridden since my father died. A shame. I have stables in Yorkshire that need exercising, and I find myself in sudden desperate need of a wife who doesn't bore me to death. Lydia missed a step. Her boot caught the edge of his shoe. She stumbled, but Dominic's arm around her waist was like an iron band keeping her upright. Are you insane? She hissed, her cheeks finally flushing with color. Highly possible, Dominic said, utterly unfazed. But I'm also extremely wealthy, which means society calls it eccentricity. We are going to finish this dance, Lydia, and then I'm going to introduce myself properly to your stepmother. I imagine she will be thrilled to speak with me. A slow, wicked smile spread across the Duke's face, changing him from intimidating to outright lethal. Lydia looked at him, realizing with a jolt of pure adrenaline that the Duke of Kinsley didn't just want to rescue her. He wanted to start a war. And for the first time in 3 years, Lydia found herself wanting to fight. The final chord of the waltz hung in the stagnant ballroom air, quickly smothered by the deafening silence of 300 aristocrats holding their breath. Dominic did not release Lydia immediately. He let his hand rest against the stiff, unforgiving fabric of her waist for 3 seconds longer than was socially acceptable. It was a deliberate stake claimed in front of an audience of vultures. When he finally stepped back, he offered his arm. Lydia looked at the offered sleeve of his black evening coat. Her fingers were cold. She placed them lightly upon his forearm. Brace yourself, Dominic murmured, his voice, a low rumble vibrating through his coat. The hyenas are circling. He turned and walked her straight toward the refreshment tables. Lady Harrington stood precisely where they had left her, gripping a carved mahogany chair so tightly her knuckles were white. Cecily hovered behind her, her pretty face pinched into an expression of sheer bewilderment. As Dominic and Lydia approached, the crowd parted. It was not out of respect, Lydia knew, but out of an ugly, ravenous curiosity. Your Grace. Lady Harrington choked out as they stopped before her. She attempted a curtsy, but her knees were entirely too stiff with outrage. She darted a venomous look at Lydia before forcing her gaze back to the Duke. How surprisingly democratic of you to take pity on my stepdaughter. Her father, rest his soul, would be so touched by your charity. Lydia's spine locked. Charity. The word was meant to slice, and it did. Dominic did not flinch. He looked down his crooked nose at Lady Harrington with an expression of profound boredom. I am not a charitable man, madam, Dominic said loudly, his voice cutting through the ambient hum of the ballroom. I danced with Miss Lydia because she was the only woman in this stifling room worth speaking to. Furthermore, she is an excellent dancer, a rare feat considering the absolute state of the music. A few yards away, the first violinist winced. Lady Harrington swallowed hard. Her smile was a rectus of panic. She physically grabbed Cecily by the elbow and shoved the girl forward. Cecily stumbled, her pink silk skirts swishing loudly. Of course, Your Grace, but surely you must be parched. Cecily fetched the Duke a glass of negus. Cecily was just telling me how much she admires your estates in the north. She is so fond of the country. Cecily looked terrified. She had never been further north than Hyde Park. Dominic looked at the girl in pink. His pale eyes scanned her up and down, a clinical dismissive assessment that lasted less than 2 seconds. "I have no use for a glass of negus," Dominic said flatly. "And I highly doubt your daughter knows the difference between a turnip and a thoroughbred. Do not throw her at my boots, Lady Harrington. It is embarrassing for both of us." Someone in the crowd behind them let out a choked gasp. Lady Harrington's face turned a violent, mottled red. "Your Grace," she sputtered, her voice rising in pitch. "You overstep. I only meant I know exactly what you meant." Dominic cut her off, his tone suddenly dropping to a dangerous, quiet register that was far more terrifying than a shout. He stepped closer to the older woman. "I heard your conversation on the terrace, every word." Lady Harrington froze. The color instantly drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking shallow and old beneath her layers of powder. Cecily let out a small whimper and stepped backward. Lydia stood perfectly still, her hand still resting on Dominic's arm. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, loud and frantic. He was destroying her stepmother. He was tearing down the carefully constructed facade of the Harrington household in front of the entire ton. It was brutal. It was terrifying. It was magnificent. "You deemed your stepdaughter a miserable creature." Dominic continued his gaze, pinning Lady Harrington like a moth to a board. "You announced that nobody would want her. You are a fool, madam. A loud, deeply unimaginative fool." He turned away from the trembling woman and looked down at Lydia. The hard, violent edge in his face vanished, replaced by a steady, unwavering focus. "I shall call upon you tomorrow at 11:00, Dominic said to Lydia. He did not ask for permission. "Be ready." Lydia met his gray eyes. She did not nod, nor did she smile. She simply held his gaze and said, "I will be." Dominic gave her a short, crisp bow. He completely ignored Lady Harrington, and Cecily turned on his heel and walked out of the ballroom. The crowd scrambled out of his way, parting like the Red Sea, before snapping back together the moment the doors closed behind him. The silence rushed back in heavier than before. Slowly, inevitably, hundreds of eyes turned to look at Lydia, the drab Pennell's mouse in the mud-brown dress. Lady Harrington turned to her. Her eyes were wide, feral with humiliation and rage. "What have you done?" She hissed, a spray of spittle hitting Lydia's cheek. Lydia calmly reached into her pocket, withdrew a threadbare linen handkerchief, and wiped her face. She looked at her stepmother, feeling a strange, hollow calm settling over her bones. "I danced, stepmother," Lydia said, "just as you instructed Cecily to do." The Harrington townhouse in Mayfair looked respectable from the street, but the morning light was merciless to the interior. It exposed the frayed edges of the Turkish rugs, the dust moes dancing in the cold air, and the water stains blooming on the parlor ceiling. Lydia sat in a rigid armchair, staring at the carriage clock on the mantelpiece. It was 10 minutes to 11. She had not slept. The night had been a prolonged screaming match locked behind closed doors. Lady Harrington had torn through the house like a hurricane, accusing Lydia of witchcraft, of bribery, of seducing the Duke in some dark corner. When the shouting failed to produce a confession, the stepmother turned to malicious logic. "He is making a fool of you." Lady Harrington had sneered over a breakfast of cold toast and weak tea. "It is a cruel joke. He despises society. Everyone knows it. He used you to insult me, and today he will leave you waiting at the window. You will be the laughing stock of London." Lydia had eaten her dry toast in silence. She knew Lady Harrington was likely right. The Duke of Kinsley was a man of impulsive, violent whims. He had made his point. There was no logical reason for him to return to a decaying house to court a penniless girl. Yet she was wearing her best day dress. It was navy blue wool, severe and unadorned, mended at the elbows, but it was clean. At precisely 11:00, the heavy brass knocker on the front door slammed 3 times. The sound echoed through the quiet house like cannon fire. Footsteps hurried across the marble foyer. The parlor door opened and a terrified-looking maid bobbed a clumsy curtsy. "The Duke of Kinsley, ma'am," she squeaked. Dominic stepped into the room. He seemed too large for the cramped, shabby parlor. He was dressed in riding clothes today, dark breeches, highly polished Hessian boots that showed the dust of the London streets, and a heavy charcoal coat. He carried no flowers. He carried a thick leather portfolio under one arm. Lady Harrington, who had been packing near the window, stopped dead. She had banked everything on him not showing up. Now faced with his overwhelming physical presence, she scrambled to recover her footing. "Your Grace," she simped, stepping forward with a forced smile. "What an unexpected pleasure. I must apologize for the state of the room we were not truly expecting." "Leave," Dominic said. Lady Harrington blinked. "I beg your pardon, I said leave." Dominic repeated his tone entirely devoid of inflection. He did not look at her, he was looking at Lydia. "I am here to speak with Miss Lydia. I require privacy. Close the door behind you." "But the proprieties," Lady Harrington gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "She is an unmarried woman under my roof. I cannot simply leave her unchaperoned with a man. It would ruin her." Dominic finally turned his head to look at the older woman. His gray eyes were cold, dead flat. "You ruined her the day you dressed her in rags and told London she was worthless. Do not invoke propriety with me, Lady Harrington. It makes you look hypocritical. Get out." For a long, agonizing moment, Lady Harrington stood her ground. But the Duke did not blink, and the sheer weight of his authority slowly crushed her defiance. Her jaw tight with fury, she turned and marched out of the parlor, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the cheap porcelain on the shelves. Dominic waited a beat, then walked over to the armchair opposite Lydia. He sat down, stretching his bad leg out in front of him with a quiet exhale, and tossed the heavy leather portfolio onto the low tea table. "She is a deeply unpleasant woman," he observed. "She has had a difficult morning," Lydia replied evenly. "She spent the entirety of breakfast convincing me you were playing a cruel joke." "Did you believe her?" Lydia considered the question. She looked at his boots, at the mud caked in the heel. "Real mud. I believed it was highly probable. Dukes do not generally marry impoverished stepdaughters. I am not a general duke." Dominic leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. The physical distance between them was entirely improper. He was close enough that she could smell leather horse and the sharp tang of bergamot soap. "I do not play jokes, Lydia. I don't have the patience for them. I am 32 years old. I have a sprawling estate in Yorkshire that requires constant supervision, 3 coal mines that keep catching fire, and a dukedom that demands an heir. I need a wife, and you decided on me." Lydia said, her tone laced with heavy skepticism. "Based on a 5-minute waltz and a shared dislike of a ballroom." "I decided on you," Dominic corrected, "because you didn't cry when your stepmother called you a pathetic burden. Because you stood against a wall looking like you wanted to burn the house down rather than beg for scraps. And because when I asked if you were grateful for a rescue, you essentially told me to go to hell." Lydia felt a sharp, unexpected bark of laughter catch in her throat. She swallowed it down. "I did not tell you to go to hell. Your eyes did." Dominic tapped a long finger against the leather portfolio. "I don't need a society bride. I don't need a girl who will faint at the sight of dirt or weep when the wind blows across the moors. It is cold in Yorkshire, Lydia. It is bleak. It is muddy, and it is far away from the opera. I need a partner who can manage a household of 500 servants and keep her head. I need a woman with iron in her spine." He looked at her, his gaze stripping away the shabby parlor, the mended dress, the years of neglect. He looked at her as if she were an equal. "I am offering you an escape," Dominic stated bluntly, "and I am asking you for your labor. It is a transaction, but I promise you this: you will never be hungry, you will never be cold. And no one will ever speak to you the way that woman spoke to you last night, not even me." Lydia stared at the leather portfolio on the table. It wasn't a romance. It was a contract. It was the most honest thing a man had ever said to her. "Open it," he said. Lydia leaned forward. Her fingers brushed against the worn leather of the portfolio as she unfastened the brass buckle. Inside was a thick stack of thick vellum paper covered in dense legal script. "What is this?" she asked, looking up. "Settlements," Dominic replied. He leaned back in his chair, watching her closely. "My solicitors drew them up at 3:00 this morning. They are extremely unhappy with me, but they are well paid. Read the second page, section 4. Lydia flipped past the sprawling legal jargon of the first page. She found the section he indicated. Her eyes scanned the lines tracing the heavy black ink. She stopped, read it again, and then looked at Dominic, her breath catching slightly in her throat. "This stipulates an independent allowance," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. £10,000 a year. settled upon me solely in my name to be paid quarterly. Dominic confirmed. Regardless of whether I am alive or dead, regardless of whether we reside together or apart, it is yours. You will never have to ask me for money to buy a pair of boots. Lydia stared at the paper. £10,000. It was a king's ransom. It was more money than her father had earned in a lifetime. It was absolute, unassailable freedom. Why? She asked. The word was sharp, defensive. She was used to traps. When a cheese is placed in a maze, there is always a spring attached to a metal bar. You do not know me. I could take this money and run away to Italy. You could, Dominic agreed calmly, but you won't. You're too pragmatic to run away from a dukedom. You want safety, Lydia. I can see it in your shoulders. You've been bracing for a blow for years. I am giving you the armor. He shifted in his chair, his bad leg protesting slightly. I told you it is a transaction. I am buying your time, your management skills, and your capacity to bear an heir. The money is compensation for the fact that you will likely find me entirely intolerable. I am taciturn. I work too much. I have a foul temper when my leg aches. Lydia looked away from the papers, studying his face, the broken nose, the harsh lines around his mouth. He wasn't pretending to be a hero. He was laying out his floors like inventory on a shop counter. I have conditions of my own, Lydia said softly. Dominic's eyebrows rose. A slow, genuine smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. I expected nothing less. Name them. Lydia sat back, crossing her hands tightly in her lap to stop them from shaking. She was holding a winning hand, but she had never played the game before. First, she said, her voice gaining strength, I will not be a prisoner in Yorkshire. If I am to manage your house, I manage it my way. I will hire and fire the staff as I see fit. You will not undermine me in front of the servants. Agreed. I hate dealing with the staff anyway. Next. Second. Lydia swallowed hard. I will not tolerate cruelty. If you have a foul temper, you will direct it at the walls, the dogs, or the moors. You will not direct it at me. If you shout at me the way my stepmother does, I will take my £10,000 and I will go to Italy. Dominic's face grew solemn. The amusement vanished from his eyes, replaced by a dark, intense sincerity. I have never raised my voice to a woman in anger, and I never will. You have my word on that, Lydia. I am rough, but I am not vicious. And third, Lydia finished, her knuckles turning white. If I marry you, I am done with this family. I will never see Lady Harrington again. I will never host Cecily. They will not receive a single penny of your wealth, nor a single ounce of your influence. They are cut off completely. Silence fell over the parlor. The carriage clock on the mantelpiece ticked steadily. Dominic stared at her. He saw the iron she was wielding. She wasn't just escaping. She was closing the door and setting the bridge on fire behind her. You are ruthless, Miss Lydia, Dominic said quietly. I learned from a master, Lydia replied, staring blankly at the door her stepmother had slammed. Dominic reached out across the low table. He offered his hand palm open, just as he had done in the ballroom the night before. But this time there was no music. There was no audience. There was only the harsh light of a Wednesday morning and the reality of a lifetime bound to a stranger. Done, Dominic said. No contact, no money, no influence. They cease to exist the moment you sign those papers. Lydia looked at his large, calloused hand. She thought of the cold toast. She thought of the mud-brown dress. She thought of the suffocating, endless years of shrinking into the walls, trying to be small enough to avoid notice. She reached out and placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, sealing the contract. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, a brief, rough point of contact that sent a strange jolt of heat up her arm. My solicitors are waiting in the carriage outside, Dominic said, not releasing her hand. We can sign the settlements now. We will require a special license from the Archbishop. I intend to marry you on Friday. Friday? Lydia gasped, her pragmatism slipping for a second. That is in 2 days. I am eager to return to Yorkshire. The weather is turning and the roads will be impossible by November. Dominic finally let go of her hand and stood up, his physical presence once again dominating the small room. He looked down at her, a predatory glint returning to his pale eyes. Pack your things, Lydia, he commanded softly. Only what you truly want to keep. Leave the brown dress. I will send a modist this afternoon to measure you for traveling clothes. He turned toward the door, then paused, looking back over his shoulder. Oh, and Lydia. Yes, Your Grace. When your stepmother inevitably asks what transpired in here today, Dominic smiled a sharp, dangerous expression that promised violence. Tell her that the miserable creature is going to be a duchess. Let her choke on that. The parlor door clicked shut behind Dominic. For a long moment, Lydia remained in the armchair, listening to the heavy, uneven cadence of his boots retreating down the hallway, followed by the definitive slam of the front door. The silence in the house lasted exactly 5 seconds. The parlor door flew open, rebounding off the wall with a crack. Lady Harrington stood in the threshold, her chest heaving, her eyes wild with a mixture of dread and ravenous curiosity. Cecily hovered in the hallway behind her, chewing nervously on her lower lip. "Well," Lady Harrington demanded. Her voice was shrill, completely stripped of its usual affected polish. "What did he say? Did he offer a settlement to drop the matter? Did he apologize for his abhorrent behavior?" Lydia stood up. She smoothed the skirt of her mended wool dress. She felt a profound, unnerving sense of calm. The crushing weight that had sat on her chest for 3 years was gone, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. "He did not apologize," Lydia said. "He proposed." Lady Harrington froze, her jaw actually slackened. For a moment she looked remarkably like a fish pulled fresh onto a dog. "He what?" "He asked me to marry him." Lydia replied, her voice flat, devoid of any triumphant inflection. "I accepted. We are to be married on Friday by special license." A profound, suffocating silence descended on the room. Cecily let out a small, high-pitched gasp. "You are lying," Lady Harrington whispered. The color drained from her face, leaving her sallow. "He is playing a game. Men like Kinsley do not marry girls like you. It is a trick. He will ruin you. His solicitors are drawing up the final papers as we speak." Lydia said, walking calmly toward the door. She did not look at her stepmother, she looked through her. "He has settled £10,000 a year on me independently. I leave on Friday for Yorkshire." Lady Harrington stepped into Lydia's path, her eyes narrowing to vicious slits. The reality was beginning to penetrate her panic, and with it came a desperate, clawing greed. £10,000. Lady Harrington repeated the number, rolling off her tongue like a prayer. Suddenly her posture changed. The sneer vanished, replaced by a grotesque, grasping smile. "Well, well, Lydia, this is unexpected but fortuitous. As your guardian, I shall of course help you manage the funds. And as the Duchess of Kinsley, you will be in a position to secure a brilliant match for Cecily, a duke's sister-in-law. The doors it will open for this family." The word was quiet, but it dropped between them like an anvil. Lady Harrington blinked. "No, what do you mean no? I am your mother. You are my father's second wife." Lydia corrected her, stepping closer. For the first time in her life she did not shrink back. She looked down into the older woman's eyes. "And you have made it abundantly clear that I am a burden. The Duke and I have agreed to a strict condition of the marriage. From the moment I sign the register on Friday, I am severed from this household. You will not receive a single penny of my allowance. You will not receive invitations to Yorkshire or London. You will not use the Kinsley name to advance, Cecily. You are cut off completely and forever." Lady Harrington's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She raised her hand, her palm open, ready to strike. Lydia did not flinch. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "Strike me," Lydia said. "Leave a mark on the face of the Duke of Kinsley's bride. See what a man who breaks rocks and builds mines for a living does to the woman who lays a hand on his property." Lady Harrington's hand trembled in the air. The threat was not an empty one. Kinsley's reputation for ruthlessness was well known. Slowly, agonizingly, her arm dropped to her side. That afternoon, the house was invaded. A terrifyingly efficient French modiste arrived with 3 assistants, 4 trunks of fabric, and strict instructions from the Duke's steward. Lady Harrington attempted to intervene, trying to steer the modiste toward purchasing fabrics for Cecily under the Kinsley account. The modiste, a woman with a stare as hard as flint, simply ignored her, ordering the stepmother out of the drawing room in rapid, flawless French. For 2 days, Lydia stood on a stool being pinned into heavy traveling wools, sturdy broadcloth dresses, and rich dark silks. On Friday morning, a massive black traveling carriage bearing the Kinsley crest pulled up to the curb. Lydia walked out the front door. She carried a single leather valise containing a book of poetry her father had given her and nothing else. She left the mud-brown dress in a heap on the floor of her attic bedroom. She did not look back. The wedding took exactly 14 minutes. It occurred in a dim, drafty chapel in Mayfair. There were no flowers, no choir, and no guests. Dominic stood beside her at the altar, a towering pillar of dark broadcloth. He spoke his vows in a firm, unrelenting baritone. Lydia spoke hers quietly, her hand steady. When the bishop pronounced them man and wife, Dominic did not kiss her. He simply nodded, offered her his arm, and led her back to the carriage. The journey to Yorkshire took 4 grueling days. The landscape shifted outside the carriage window, transforming from the manicured green softness of the south to a harsh, sprawling expanse of moors, crags, and dark stone. The air grew colder, biting through the gaps in the carriage doors. They did not speak much. Dominic spent hours reviewing ledgers and correspondence, his brow furrowed in concentration. Lydia watched the world rush by. She felt a strange detachment, as if she were reading a story about someone else. She was a duchess. It felt like an ill-fitting coat. "You are quiet," Dominic remarked on the third afternoon, putting down his silver-rimmed reading glasses. "I am observing," Lydia replied. She pulled her new heavy wool cloak tighter around her shoulders. "It is very bleak out there." "It is honest," Dominic corrected, looking out at the rolling gray moors. "The South is entirely built on pretense. The North doesn't care about your bloodline. If you are stupid, the winter will kill you. If you are lazy, you will starve. The land demands competence." He turned his pale eyes back to her. "I hope you brought yours. I have survived my stepmother for 3 years. Your Grace," Lydia said dryly. "I'm entirely capable of surviving a bit of wind." The corner of his mouth twitched. "Call me Dominic." They arrived at Ashdown Manor at dusk. It was not a delicate, symmetrical Palladian villa. It was a fortress built of dark, rough, honeyed stone. It sat upon a rise overlooking a sweeping valley. It looked ancient, impenetrable, and deeply intimidating. The staff was lined up in the massive entrance hall. There were dozens of them. They stared at Lydia with thinly veiled skepticism. They had heard the rumors. The Duke had married a penniless nobody from a London ballroom. They expected a fragile, weeping southern flower who would flee back to the opera by Christmas. Dominic stepped out of his great coat, handing it to a footman. "Mrs. Gable," he said, addressing a stern-looking woman with iron-gray hair. "This is the Duchess. She has absolute authority over the house. You will bring the household ledgers, the pantry inventories, and the staff rosters to her study tomorrow morning at 9:00. He looked at Lydia. "I have a mine manager waiting for me in the library. I will see you at dinner." He walked away, his limp slightly more pronounced from the long journey, leaving Lydia standing alone before an army of servants. Mrs. Gable stepped forward, her posture rigid. "Your Grace, shall I have a maid show you to your chambers? You must be exhausted. We can review the ledgers next week when you are recovered." It was a test, a polite differential test to see how easily she could be managed. Lydia straightened her spine. She looked at Mrs. Gable, projecting the same cold, unyielding authority she had seen Dominic use to crush Lady Harrington. "I am not an invalid." "Mrs. Gable," Lydia said, her voice carrying clearly through the stone hall, "I do not require a week to recover from sitting in a carriage. We will review the ledgers tomorrow at 9:00 precisely and have the cook send up a pot of strong black tea. It is freezing in this corridor." Mrs. Gable blinked, surprised. Then a microscopic nod of approval tipped her chin. "Very good, Your Grace. Right away." Over the next month, Lydia proved she was no fragile flower. She attacked the household management with a ruthless, pragmatic efficiency. She discovered the previous steward had been skimming funds from the butcher's accounts. She fired him on a Tuesday and hired a local merchant's son by Thursday. She reorganized the linen closets, negotiated better prices for the winter coal delivery, and memorized the names of all 80 indoor servants. She did not seek to be loved. She sought to be effective. Dominic watched her. He said very little, but Lydia caught him observing her during dinner. Their evenings were quiet, solitary affairs. They ate at opposite ends of a long mahogany table, the space between them illuminated by heavy silver candelabras. They discussed crop yields, roof repairs, and the price of iron ore. It was a business partnership. It was exactly what they had agreed upon. Yet Lydia found herself anticipating those dinners. She liked the sharp, cynical edge of his intellect. She liked that he never patronized her. When she suggested a new rotation schedule for the scullery maids to prevent exhaustion, he didn't coddle her with praise. He simply reviewed her math, nodded, and told her to implement it. He was a hard man, but he was fair. And in his house, for the first time in her life, Lydia felt safe. The winter came early, and it came with violence. In late November, a massive blizzard swept off the moors, burying the estate in 3 feet of snow. The wind howled against the thick glass of the Mana windows like a physical entity trying to break in. Lydia was in her study, going over the weekly accounts when the door banged open. Dominic stood in the threshold. He was covered in snow, his heavy coat soaked through his face, pale and drawn tight with pain. He was leaning heavily against the doorframe, refusing to put weight on his left leg. Lydia dropped her pen. The ink splattered across the ledger. She crossed the room in 3 strides. What happened? The roof on the eastern tenant barn gave way under the snow. Dominic grunted, his breath coming in shallow, ragged rasps. I was helping the men shore up the main beam. A timber slipped, caught my bad leg. He tried to take a step forward and nearly collapsed. Lydia caught him. He was incredibly heavy, a solid wall of dense muscle and wet wool. She wrapped her arm around his waist, wedging her shoulder under his armpit. "Do not argue with me," she commanded sharply as he tried to pull away. "Lean on me now," he swore under his breath, but he complied, letting her take a portion of his weight. Together they navigated the long, drafty corridor to his private chambers on the ground floor. The fire in his room was burning low. Lydia deposited him heavily into a leather armchair near the hearth. He let out a low groan, his head falling back against the leather, his eyes squeezing shut. "I will ring for a footman," Lydia said, turning toward the bell pull, "and send for the doctor." "No, Dr. Dominic," barked, his voice tight. "The roads are impossible anyway. And no footmen. I don't want them hovering over me like I'm a dying horse. Just get the boots off." Lydia stopped. She looked at him. He was a proud, arrogant man, and he hated being seen in a state of vulnerability. He was trusting her with his weakness. She did not hesitate. She knelt on the cold stone hearth. His boots were caked in ice and mud. The leather was stiff and unyielding. Lydia gripped the heel of his right boot first, tugging it off with a sharp pull. Then she moved to the left leg. "Careful," he hissed through his teeth. "I know," she said calmly. She was gentle. She worked the leather loose millimeter by millimeter, supporting his calf with her other hand to prevent the leg from jarring. When the boot finally slid free, he let out a long, shuddering exhale. His trousers were soaked with melting snow. Lydia stood up, stripped off her own fine wool shawl, and threw it over the back of a chair. "You need to get out of those wet clothes or the cold will settle into the joint permanently," she said, her voice entirely practical. She walked to his washstand, poured a bowl of water, and grabbed a clean towel. Dominic opened his eyes and looked at her. She was kneeling by the fire again, stoking the coals with an iron poker, her dark hair slipping out of its neat pins. She wasn't acting like a duchess. She was acting like a partner. With a grimace, he unbuttoned his soaked coat and let it drop to the floor. He managed to strip off his waistcoat and shirt, his chest heaving with the effort. Lydia turned back. She did not blush. She looked at the heavy scarring on his left thigh, the twisted ruined tissue from a long-ago riding accident, now swollen and violently bruised from the falling timber. She took the towel, dipped it in the water, and began to wipe the freezing mud from his leg. Her touch was firm, clinical, and completely devoid of pity. "It's a nasty contusion," she noted, wringing out the towel. "But the bone isn't broken. You will be confined to this chair for at least 3 days. And if you try to walk on it, I will personally lock the door from the outside." A low, raspy chuckle vibrated in Dominic's chest. He looked down at the top of her head. "You are a deeply bossy woman, Lydia. Someone has to manage you," she replied, not looking up. She dried his leg, her hands moving with a steady, rhythmic competence. "You have a terrible habit of treating your own body like a piece of farm machinery." She reached for a thick woolen blanket draped over the bed and dragged it to the chair, tucking it tightly around his legs to trap the heat of the fire. As she leaned over him to adjust the blanket, Dominic reached out. He caught her wrist. Lydia froze. She looked up. His face was only inches from hers. The gray eyes that were usually so cold and assessing were dark, entirely focused on her. The air in the room suddenly felt very thick. the crackle of the fire deafeningly loud. "You did not flinch," he said quietly. "Most people flinch when they see the leg. It's a leg, Dominic, not a monster." Lydia kept her voice level, though her pulse had suddenly begun to hammer frantically in her throat. "It does not define you." His thumb brushed over the inside of her wrist, finding the erratic jump of her pulse. "You are an excellent investment, Lydia," he murmured. The cynical edge was there, but it sounded hollow, like a shield he was trying and failing to hold up. Lydia felt a sudden, sharp flare of anger. She pulled her wrist out of his grasp and stood up straight, looking down at him. "Do not do that," she said, her voice ringing with hard authority. Dominic frowned. "Do what? Reduce this to a ledger." Lydia snapped, her pragmatism finally cracking, giving way to the fierce, hidden heart she had guarded for years. "Do not pretend this is just a transaction. I did not kneel in the mud to pull off your boots because you pay me £10,000 a year. I did it because you were in pain. I did it because you are my husband." She stared at him, breathing heavily. She had laid her cards on the table. She had shown him that she cared. It was the most dangerous thing she had done since leaving London. Dominic stared back at her, the silence stretched. The wind battered the glass outside. Then slowly he reached out again. This time he didn't grab her wrist. He wrapped his large, calloused hand around the back of her neck. He pulled her down. Lydia didn't resist. She let herself be pulled. When his mouth met hers, there was nothing polite or gentle about it. It was a collision. It was desperate, grounded, and intensely real. It tasted of smoke, cold air, and an overwhelming territorial hunger. He kissed her like a man who had spent his entire life in a freezing room and had finally found a fire. Lydia pushed her hands into his hair, gripping him fiercely, kissing him back with a ferocity that matched his own. All the years of shrinking into walls, of being silent, of being told she was unwanted, evaporated into the heat of his skin. He broke the kiss, resting his forehead against hers. Both of them were breathing hard. "Nobody wanted you," Dominic whispered, his voice rough, quoting the insult that had brought them together. He ran his thumb along her jawline, his eyes fiercely possessive. "They were blind fools. You are the only real thing I have ever found." Lydia rested her hands on his bare shoulders. She felt the heavy, steady beating of his heart beneath her palms. The cynical armor they both wore hadn't been discarded. It had simply been melted down and forged into something unbreakable between them. "I am exactly where I want to be," Lydia said quietly. She wasn't a drab little mouse anymore. She was the Duchess of Kinsley. She was the master of the stone fortress, the partner to a dangerous man, and she was finally home. Thank you for experiencing the complete story of Nobody Will Want Her. From a cruel whisper in a London ballroom to a fierce, undeniable partnership in the brutal cold of Yorkshire, Lydia and Dominic proved that true strength isn't about fitting into high society. It's about surviving the storm together. If this deeply grounded romance struck a chord with you, please like the video, share it with fellow lovers of historical drama, and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below telling us your favorite moment between the Duke and his resilient Duchess. Until the next story.